Hi there. I'm your imaginary friend. I've got a story for you. This is by Matthew Phipps Shiel. Now, as always, bear in mind that sometimes an author will have included something in their work that, at the time of writing, seemed fine to them. That's not always fine. This is called The House of Sounds. It begins with a quote from Dante, E cade come l'uom qui sonnopiglia, and it translates to, and I fell like a man who's overcome by sleep. A good many years ago, when a young man, a student in Paris, I knew the great Corot, and witnessed by his side many of those cases of mind malady, in the analysis of which he was such a master. I remember one little maid of the Marais, who until the age of 9 did not differ from her playmates, but one night, lying abed, she whispered into her mother's ear, "Mamma, can you not hear the sound of the world?" It appears that her geography had just taught her that our globe reels with an enormous velocity on an orbit about the sun, and this sound of the world of hers was merely a murmur in the ear, heard in the silence of night. Within 6 months, she was as mad as a March hare. I mentioned the case to my friend, Heiko Harfager, then occupying with me an old mansion in Saint Germain, shut in by a wall and jungle of shrubbery. He listened with singular interest, and during a good while sat wrapped in gloom. Another case which I gave made a great impression upon my friend, a young man, a toy maker of Saint Antoine, suffering from consumption, but sober, industrious, returning one gloaming to his garret, happened to purchase one of those factious journals which circulate by lamplight over the boulevards. This simple act was the beginning of his doom. He had never been a reader, and knew little of the real and turmoil of the world. But the next night he purchased another journal. Soon he acquired a knowledge of politics, the huge movements, the tumult of life, and this interest grew absorbing. Till late into the night, every night, he lay poring over the roar of action, the printed passion. He would awake sick but brisk in spirit, and bought a morning paper, and the more his teeth gnashed, the less they ate. He grew negligent, irregular at work, turning on his bed through the day. Rags overtook him. As the grand interest grew upon his frail soul, so every lesser interest failed in him. There came a day when he no more cared for his own life, and another day when he tore the hairs from his head. As to this man, the great Corot said to me, "Really, one does not know whether to chuckle or to weep over such a business. Observe, for one thing, how diversely men are made. There are minds precisely so sensitive as a thread of melted lead. Every breath will fret and trouble them. And how about the hurricane? For such this scheme of things is clearly no fit habitation, but a machine of death, a baleful immense. Too cruel to some is the rushing shriek of being. They cannot stand the world. Let each look well to his own little shred of existence, I say, and leave the monstrous automaton alone. Here in this poor toy maker you have a case of the ear. It is only the neurosis oxyakoia. Grand was that Greek myth of the harpies. By them was this creature snatched away, or say, caught by a limb in the wheels of the universe, and so perished. It is quite a ravishing exit. Translation in a chariot of flame. Only remember that the member first seized was the pinna. He bent ear to the howl of the world, and ended by himself howling. Between chaos and our shoes swings, I assure you, the thinnest film. I knew a man who had this oral peculiarity, that every sound brought him some knowledge of the matter causing the sound. A rod, for instance, of mixed copper and tin, striking upon a rod of mixed iron and lead, conveyed to him not merely the proportion of each metal in each rod, but some knowledge of the essential meaning and spirit, as it were, of copper, of tin, of iron, and of lead. Him also did the harpies snatch aloft. I've mentioned that I related some of these cases to my friend Harfager, and I was astonished at the obvious pains which he gave himself to hide his interest, his gaping nostrils. From first days when we happened to attend the same seminary in Stockholm, an intimacy had sprung up between us, but it was not an intimacy accompanied by the ordinary signs of friendship. Harfager was the shyest, most isolated of beings. Though our joint housekeeping, brought about by a chance meeting at a midnight séance, had now lasted some months, I knew nothing of his plans. Through the day we read together, he rapped back into the past, I engrossed with the present. Late at night we reclined on sofas within the vast cave of a hearth-place Louis XI, and smoked over the dying fire in silence. Occasionally a soirée or lecture might draw me from the house. Except once, I never understood that Harfager left it. On that occasion I was hurrying through the Rue Saint-Honor, when a rush of traffic rattled over the old pavers retained there, and when I came upon him, in this tumult he stood in a listening attitude, and for a moment did not know me. Even as a boy, I had seen in my friend the genuine patrician, not that his personality gave any impression of loftiness or opulence. On the contrary, he did, however, suggest an incalculable ancientness, and I've known no nobleman who so bore in his expression the assurance of the essential prince, whose pale blossom is of yesterday, and will perish tomorrow, but whose root shoots through the ages. This much I knew of Harfager. Also, that on one or other of his islands north of Zetland lived his mother and an aunt, that he was somewhat deaf, but liable to 1,000 torments or delights at certain sounds, the whine of a door, the note of a bird. He was somewhat under the middle height and inclined to portliness. His nose rose high aquiline from that sort of brow called the musical, that is, with temples which incline outward to the cheekbones, making breadth for the base of the brain, while the direction of the heavy-lidded eyes and of the eyebrows was a downward droop from the nose of their outer ends. He wore a thin chin-beard, but the feature of his face were the ears, which were nearly circular, very small and flat, without that outer curve called the helix. I came to understand that this had long been a trait of his race. Over the whole wan face of my friend was engraved an air of woeful inability, utter gravity of sorrow. One said Sardanapalus, frail last of the race of Nimrod. After a year I found it necessary to mention to Harfager my intention of leaving Paris, as we reclined one night in our nooks within the fireplace. He replied to my tidings with a polite "Indeed," and continued to gloat over the grate. But after an hour turned to me and observed, "Well, it seems to be a hard world." Truisms, uttered in just such a tone of discovery, I occasionally heard from him, but his earnest gaze, his despondency, now astonished me. "Apropos of what?" I asked. "My friend, do not leave me." He spread his arms. I learned that he was the object of a devilish malice, that he was the prey of a horrible temptation, that a lure, a becking hand, a lurking lust which it was the effort of his life to escape, and to which he was especially liable in solitude, perpetually enticed him, and that so had it been almost from the day when, at the age of 5, he had been sent by his father from his desolate home in the ocean. And whose was this malice? He told me his mother's and his aunt's. And what was this temptation? He said it was the temptation to go back, to hurry with the very frenzy of hunger back to that home. I demanded with what motives and in what way the malice of his mother and aunt manifested itself. He answered that there was, he fancied, no definite motive, but only a fated malevolence, and that the respect in which it manifested itself was the prayers and commands with which they plagued him to go again to the hold of his ancestors. All this I could not understand, and said so. In what consisted this magnetism and this peril of his home? To this Harfager did not reply, but rising from his seat, disappeared behind the hearth curtains and left the apartment. When he returned, it was with a quarto tome bound in hide, which proved to be Hugh Gascoigne's Chronicle of Norse Families in English blackletter. The passage to which he pointed I read as follows. Now of these two brothers, the older, Harold, being of seemly personage and prowess, did go a pilgrimage into Danemark, wherefrom he repaired again home to Hjaltland, Zetland, and with him fetched the amiable Thronda for his wife, who was a daughter of the Sank blood royal of Danemark, and his younger brother Svein, that was sad and debonair, but far surpassed the other in cunning, received him with all good cheer. But eftsoons, soon after, fell Svein sick for all his love that he had of Thronda, his brother's wife. And while the worthy Harold ministered about the bed where Svein lay sick, lo, Svein fastened on him a violent stroke with a sword, and with no longer tarrying enclosed his hands in bonds, and cast him in the bottom of a deep hold. And because Harold would not deprive himself of the governance of Thronda his wife, Svein cut off both his ears, and put out one of his eyes, and after divers such torments was ready to slay him. But on a day the valiant Harold, breaking his bonds and embracing his adversary, did by the sleight of wrestling overthrow him, and escaped. Notwithstanding, he faltered when he came to the Somberg Head, not far from the castle, and albeit that he was swift-foot, could no farther run, by reason that he was faint with the long plagues of his brother. And whilst he lay there in a swoon, did Svein come upon him, and when he had stricken him with a dart, cast him from Somberg Head into the sea. Not long hereafterward did the Lady Thronda, though she knew not the manner of her lord's death, nor verily if he was dead or alive, receive Svein into favour, and with great gaudying and blowing of beamus, trumpets, did become his wife. And right soon they two went thence to sojourn in far parts. Now it befell that Sweyn was minded by a dream to have built a great mansion in Hjaltland for the homecoming of the Lady Thronda. Wherefore he called to him a cunning master workman, and sent him to England to gather men for the building of this lusty house, while he himself remained with his lady at Rome. Then came this architect to London, but, passing thence to Hjaltland, was drowned, he and his fears, mates, all in sum. And after 2 years, which was the time assigned, Svein Harfager sent a letter to Hjaltland to understand how his great house did, for he knew not of the drowning of the architect. And soon after he received an answer that the house did well, and was building on the Isle of Reba. But that was not the isle where Svein had appointed the building to be, and he was afeard, and near fell down dead for dread, because in the letter he saw before him the manner of writing of his brother Harold. And he said in this form, Surely Harold is alive, else be this letter writ with ghostly hand. And he was woe many days, seeing that this was a deadly stroke. Thereafter he took himself back to Hjaltland to know how the matter was, and there the old castle on Somberg Head was brake down to the earth. Then Svein was woed wroth, and cried, Jesu mercy, where is all the great house of my fathers gone? Alas, this wicked day of destiny! And one of the people told him that a host of workmen from far parts had brake it down. And he said, Who hath bid them? But that could none answer. Then he said again, Is not my brother Harold alive? For I have behold his writing. And that too could none answer. So he went to Reba, and saw there a great house stand. And when he looked on it, he said, This sooth was ye built by my brother Harold, be he dead or be he on live. And there he dwelt, and his lady, and his sons' sons until now, for that the house is ruthless and without pity. Wherefore 'tis said that upon all who dwell there falleth a wicked madness and a lecherous anguish, and that by way of the ears do they drink the cup of the fury of the earless Harold, till the time of the house be ended. After I had read the narrative half aloud, I smiled, saying, This, Harfager, is very tolerable romance on the part of the good Gascoigne, but has the look of indifferent history. It is nevertheless history, he replied. You believe that. The house stands solidly on Reba. But you believe the medieval ghosts superintended the building of their family mansions? Gascoigne nowhere says that, he answered. For to be stricken with a dart is not necessarily to die, nor, if he did say it, have I any knowledge on the subject. And what, Harfager, is the nature of that wicked madness, that lecherous anguish of which Gascoigne speaks? Do you ask me? He spread his arms. What do I know? I know nothing. I was banished from the place at the age of 5. Yet the cry of it still rings in my mind. And have I not told you of anguishes, even in myself, of inherited longing and loathing? Anyway, I had to go to Heidelberg just then, so I said I would compromise by making my absence short and rejoin him in a few weeks. I took his moody silence to mean assent, and soon afterwards left him. But I was detained, and when I got back to our old house, found it empty. Harfager was gone. It was only after 12 years that a letter was forwarded me, a rather wild letter, an awfully long one, in the writing of my friend. It was dated at Reba. From the writing I understood that it had been dashed off with furious haste, so that I was the more astonished at the very trivial nature of the contents. On the first half-page he spoke of our old friendship, and asked if I would see his mother, who was dying. The rest of the epistle consisted of an analysis of his mother's family tree, the apparent aim being to show me that she was a genuine Harfager and a distant cousin of his father. He then went on to comment on the great prolificness of his race, stating that since the 14th century over 4 million of its members had lived, 3 only of them, he believed, being now left. This settled, the letter ended. Influenced by this, I travelled northward, reached Caithness, passed the stormy Orkneys, reached Lerwick, and from Unst, the most bleak and northerly of the Zetlands, contrived, by dint of bribes, to pit the weather-worthiness of a lug-sailed Sixern, identical with the long ships of the Vikings, against a flowing sea and an ugly sky. The trip, I was told, was at such a season of some risk. It was the sombre December of those seas, and the weather, they said, although never cold, is seldom other than tempestuous. A mist now lay over the billows, enclosing our boat in a dome of doleful gloaming, and there was a ghostly something in the look of the silent sea and brooding sky which produced upon my nerves the mood of a journey out of nature, a cruise beyond the world. Occasionally, however, we ran past one of those skerries, or sea stacks whose craggy sea walls, disintegrated by the struggles of the Gulf Stream with the North Sea, had a look of awful ruin and havoc. But I only noticed 3 of these, for before the dun day had well run half its course, sudden darkness was upon us, and with it one of those storms of which the winter of this semi-Arctic sea is one succession. During the haggard glimpse of the following day, the rain did not stop. But before darkness had quite fallen, my skipper, who talked continuously to a maid of seal maidens and water horses and gruels, paused to point me out a mound of gloomier grey on the weather bow, which he said should be Reba. Reba, he said, was the centre of quite a nest of those roasts, eddies, and cross-currents which the tidal wave hurls with complicated swirlings among all the islands. But at Reba they ran with more than usual angriness, owing to the row of sea crags which garrisoned the land around. Approach was therefore at all times difficult, and at night foolhardy. With a running sea, however, we came sufficiently close to see the mane of foam which railed round the coast wall. Its shock, according to the captain, had often more than all the efficiency of artillery, tossing tons of rock to heights of 600 feet upon the island. When the sun next pried above the horizon, we had closely approached the coast, and it was then that for the first time the impression of some spinning motion of the island, due probably to the swirling movements of the water, was produced upon me. We effected a landing at a Vaux, or a sea arm, on the west coast. The east, though the point of my aim, was out of the question on account of the swell. Here I found in 2 scales, or sheds, thatched with pheal, 5 or 6 seamen. who gained a livelihood by trading for the groceries of the great house on the east, and, taking one of them for a guide, I began the climb of the island. Now, during the night in the boat, I'd been aware of a booming in the ears, for which even the roar of the sea round the coast seemed insufficient to account. And this now, as we went on, became immensely augmented, and with it, once more, that conviction within me of spinning motions. Reba I found to be a land of precipices of granite and flagging ice at about the center. However, we came upon a tableland sloping from west to east and covered by a lot of locks, which sullenly flowed into one another. I could see no shore eastward to this chain of waters, and by dint of shouting to my leader and bending ear to his shoutings, I came to know that there was no such shore. I say shout, for nothing less could have sounded through the steady bellowing as of 10,000 bisons that now resounded on every side. Certain trembling, too, of the earth became distinct. In vain, meantime, did the eye in its dreary survey seek a tree or shrub, for no kind of vegetation, save peat, could brave for a day the perennial tempest of this benighted island. Darkness, half an hour after noon, commenced to fall upon us, and it was soon afterwards that my guide, pointing down a defile near the east coast, hurriedly started back upon the way he had come. I bawled a question after him as he went, but at this point the voice of mortals had ceased to be in the least audible. Down this defile, with a sinking of the heart and a singular sickness of giddiness, I passed, and on reaching its end, emerged upon a ledge of rock which shuddered to the immediate onsets of the sea, though all this part of the island was, besides, in the grip of an ague not due to the great guns of the sea. Hugging a crag of cliff for steadiness from the gusts, I gazed forth upon a scene not less eerily dismal than some drear district of the dreams of Dante. 3 skerries, flanked by stacks as fantastic and twisted as a witch's finger, and giving a home to hosts of osprey and skart, seal and walrus, lay at some fathoms distance, and from its rush among them the sea, in blanched tumultuous but inaudible wrath, like an army with banners, ranted toward the land. Letting go my crag, I staggered some distance to the left, and now all at once an amphitheatre opened before me, and there broke upon my view a panorama of such appalling majesty as had never entered my heart to fancy. An amphitheatre, I said, but it was rather the form of a Norman door that I saw. Fancy such a door, half a mile wide, flat on the ground, the rounded part farthest from the sea, and all round it led a wall of rock tower, perpendicular 40 yards. And now down this rounded door shape, and over its whole extent, let a roaring ocean roll its tonnage in a hoary fury, and the stupor with which I looked, and then the shrinking, and then the instinct of flight will find comprehension. This was the disemboguement of the locks of Reba. And within the curve of this Norman cataract, robed in the world of its smokes and far excursive surfs, stood a fabric of brass. The last beam of the day had now nearly passed, but I could still see through the mists which bleakly nimbused it as in tears that the building was low in proportion to the hugeness of its circumference, that it was roofed with a dome, and that round it ran 2 rows of Norman windows, the upper smaller than the lower. Certain indications led me to infer that the house had been founded upon a bed of rock which lay, circular and detached, within the curve of the cataract, but this nowhere emerged above the flood, for the whole floor which I had before me dashed one reeking deep river to the beachless sea, passage to the mansion being made possible by a massive causeway bridge, with arches, all bearded with seaweed. Descending from my ledge, I passed along it, now drenched in spray, and as I came nearer could see that the house, too, was to half its height more thickly bearded than an old hull with barnacles and every variety of bright seaweed. Also, what was very surprising, that from many spots near the top of that brazen wall, ponderous chains, dropping beards, reached out in rays, so that the fabric had the aspect of a many-anchored ark. But without pausing to look closely, I pushed forward, and rushing through the smooth waterfall which poured all around from the roof, By one of its many porches, I entered the dwelling. Darkness was now around me, and sound. I seemed to stand in the center of some yelling planet, the row resembling the resounding of many thousands of cannons, punctuated by strange crashing and breaking uproars, and a madness descended upon me. I was near to tears. Here, I said, is the place of weeping, not elsewhere is the vale of sighing. However, I passed forward through a succession of halls, and was wondering where to go next, when a hideous figure with a lamp in his hand stamped towards me. I shrank from him. It seemed the skeleton of a lank man wrapped in a winding sheet, till the light of one tiny eye and a film of skin over a portion of the face reassured one. Of ears he showed no sign. His name, I afterwards learned, was Eighth, and his appearance was explained by his pretense, true or false, that he had once suffered burning, almost to the cinder stage, but had somehow recovered. With an expression of malice and agitated gestures, he led the way to a chamber on the upper stage, where, having struck light to a taper, he made signs toward a spread table, and left me. For a long time, I sat in solitude, conscious of the shaking of the mansion, though every sense was swallowed up and confounded in the one impression of sound. Water was the world, a nightmare on my breast, a desire to gasp for breath, a tingling on my nerves, a sense of being infinitely drowned and buried in boundless deluges. And when the feeling of giddiness, too, increased, I sprang up and paced. It suddenly stopped, angry, I scarce knew why, with myself. I had, in fact, caught myself walking with a certain hurry, not usual with me, not natural to me. So I forced myself to stand and take note of the hall. It was large and damp with mist, so that its tattered but rich furniture looked lost in it, its center occupied by a tomb bearing the name of a Harfager of the 14th century, and its walls old panels of oak. Having drearily seen these, I waited on with an intolerable consciousness of solitude. But a little after midnight the tapestry parted, and Harfager, with a rapid stalk, walked in. In 12 years my friend had grown old. He showed, it is true, a tendency to portliness, yet to a knowing eye he was in reality tabid, ill-nourished, and his neck stuck forward from his chest, and the lower part of his back had quite a forward bend of age, and his hair floated about his face and shoulders in a wildness of awful whiteness, while a white chin-beard hung to his chest. His dress was a robe of bauge, which, as he went, waved affluent with his bare and hairy shins, and he was shod in those soft slippers called rivlins. To my astonishment, he spoke. When I passionately shouted that I could gather no fragment of sound from his moving mouth, he clapped both his palms to his ears, and then anew besieged mine, but again without result, and now with an angry throw of the hand he caught up his taper and walked from the apartment. There was something strikingly unnatural in his manner, something which reminded me of the skeleton. Eighth, an excess of zeal, a fever, a rage, a loudness, an eagerness of gait, a great extravagance of gesture. His hand constantly dashed whiffs of hair from a face which, though of the saffron of death, had red eyes, thick-lidded eyes, fixed in a downward and sideward gaze. When he came back to me, it was with a leaf of ivory and a piece of graphite hanging from the cord tied round his garment, and he rapidly wrote a petition that, if not too tired, I would take part with him in the funeral of his mother. I shouted assent. Once more he clapped his palms to his ears, then wrote, "Do not shout. No whisper in any part of the building is inaudible to me." I remembered that in early life he'd been slightly deaf. We passed together through many apartments, he shading the taper with his hand, a necessary action, for, as I quickly discovered, in no nook of the quivering building was the air in a state of rest, but was forever commoved by a curious agitation, a faint windiness like an echo of tempests, which communicated a universal nervousness to the curtains. Everywhere I met the same past grandeur, present raggedness and decay. In many of the rooms were tombs. One was a museum, thronged with bronzes, but broken, grown with fungoids, dripping with moisture. It was as if the mansion, in ardor of travail, sweated, and a miasma of decomposition tainted all the air. I followed Harfager through the maze of his way with some difficulty, for he went headlong, only once stopping, when with a face ungainly wild over the glare of the light he tossed up his fingers and gave out a single word. From the form of his lips I guessed the word, "Hark!" Presently we entered a very long chamber, in which, on chairs beside a bed, lay a coffin flanked by a file of candles. The coffin was very deep, and had this singularity that the footpiece was absent, so that the soles of the corpse could be seen as we approached. I saw three upright rods secured to a side of the coffin, each rod fitted at its top with a little silver bell, of the sort called maurice, pendant from a flexible spring, and at the head of the bed, Eighth, with an air of irascibility, was stamping to and fro within a narrow area. Harfager deposited the taper upon a stone table, and stood poring with a crazy intentness over the body. I too stood and looked at death, so grim and rigorous as I think I never saw. The coffin looked angrily full of tangled grey locks, the lady being of great age, bony and hook-nosed. Her face shook with solemn constancy to the quivering of the building. I noticed that over the body had been fixed 3 bridges, like the bridge of a violin, their sides fitting into grooves in the coffin's sides, and their tops of a shape to fit the slope of the 2 coffin lids when closed. One of these bridges passed over the knees of the dead lady, another bridged her stomach, the third her neck. In each of them was a hole, and across each of the 3 holes passed a string from the maurice bell above it, the 3 holes being thus divided by the 3 tight strings into 6 semicircles. Before I could guess the significance of all this, Harfager closed the folding coffin lids, which had little holes for the passage of the 3 strings. He then turned the key in the lock and uttered a word which I took to be "come." Eighth now took hold of the handle at the coffin's head, and out of the dark parts of the hall a lady in black walked forward. She was tall, pallid, of impossible aspect. From the curvature of her nose and her circular ears, I guessed her the Lady Svertha, aunt of Harfager. Her eyes were quite red, as if with crying, I could not tell. Harfager and I taking each a handle near the coffin foot, and the lady bearing before us one of the black candlesticks, the obsequies began. When I got to the doorway, I noticed in a corner there were 2 more coffins engraved with the names Harfager and his aunt. Thence we wound our way down a wide stairway winding to a lower floor, and descending thence to still lower by narrow brass steps, came to a portal of metal where the lady, depositing the candlestick, left us. The chamber of death into which we now bore the body had for its outer wall the brazen outer wall of the whole house, at a spot where this closely approached the cataract, and was no doubt profoundly drowned in the world of surge without, so that the earthquake there was urgent. On every side the place was piled with coffins, ranged high and wide upon shelves, and the huge rush and scampering which ensued on our entrance proved it the paradise of troops of rats. As it was inconceivable that these could have eaten a way through 16 brazen feet, for even the floor here was brazen, I assumed that some fruitful pair must have found in the house on its building an ark from the waters. Even this guess, though, seemed wild, and Harfager afterwards confided to me his suspicion that they had for some reason been placed there by the original builder. We deposited our load upon a stone bench in the centre, whereupon Eighth made haste to be away. Harfager then repeatedly walked from end to end of the place, scrutinizing with many a stoop and peer and upward stretch the shelves and their props. Could he, I was led to wonder, have any doubts as to their soundness? Damp, in fact, and decay pervaded everything. A bit of timber which I touched crumbled to dust under my thumb. He presently beckoned to me, and with yet one halt and "hark!" from him, we passed through the house to my chamber, where, left alone, I paced about, agitated with a vague anger, then tumbled to an agony of slumber. In the far interior of the mansion, even the bleared day of this land of bleakness never rose upon our gloom, but I was able to regulate my gettings up by a clock which stood in my chamber. Or I was called by Harfager, with whom in a short time I renewed more than all our former friendship. That I should say more is curious, but so it was, and And this was proved by the fact that we grew to take and to excuse freedoms of speech and of manner which, as two persons of more than usual reserve, we had once never dreamed of permitting to ourselves in respect of each other. Once, for example, in our pacings of aimless haste down passages that vanished in shadow and length of perspective remoteness, he wrote that my step was very slow. I replied that it was just such a step as suited my then mood. He wrote, "You have developed a tendency to fret." I was very offended, and said, "Certainly there are more fingers than one in the world which that ring will fit." Another day he was no less than rude to me for seeking to reveal to him the secret of the unhuman keenness of his hearing, and of mine, for I too, to my dismay, began as time passed to catch hints of shouted sounds. The cause might be found, I asserted, in a fervour of the auditory nerve, which, if the cataract were absent, the roar of the ocean and the row of the perpetual tempest round us might by themselves be sufficient to bring about. His own ear interior, I said, must be inflamed to an exquisite pitch of fever, and I named the disease to him as the pericosis willisio. He frowned dissent. I, quite undeterred, proceeded to relate the case that had occurred within my own experience of a very deaf lady who could hear the drop of a pin in a railway train. And now he made me the reply, "Of ignorant people I am accustomed to consider the mere scientist the most ignorant." But I, for my part, regarded it as merely far-fetched that he should pretend to be in the dark as to the morbid state of his hearing. He himself, indeed, confessed to me his own, Eighth's, and the Lady Swerth's proneness to paroxysms of vertigo. I was startled, for I had myself shortly previously been roused out of sleep by feelings of reeling and nausea, and an assurance that the room furiously flew round with me. The impression passed away, and I attributed it, perhaps hastily, to some disturbance in the nerve endings of the labyrinth or the inner ear. In Harfager, however, the conviction of whirling motions in the house, in the world, got to so horrible a degree of certainty that its effects sometimes resembled those of lunacy or energumental possession. Never, he said, was the sensation of giddiness altogether dead in him. Seldom the sensation that he gazed with stretched out arms over the brink of abysms which wooed his half-consenting foot. Once as he walked, he was hurled as by unearthly powers to the ground, and there for an hour sprawled, bathed in sweat, with distraught bedazzlement and amaze in his stare, which watched the racing walls. He was constantly racked, moreover, with the consciousness of sounds so peculiar in their character that I could account for them on no other supposition than that of a tinnitus infinitely sick. Through the roar there sometimes visited him, he told me, the lullaby of some bird, from the burden of whose song he had the consciousness that she derived from a very remote country, was of the whiteness of foam, and crested with a comb of mauve. Or else he knew of accumulated human tones, distant yet articulate, busily contending in volubility, and in the end melting into a medley of musical movements. Or anon he was shocked by an infinite and imminent crashing, like the monstrous racket of the crackling of a cosmos of crockery round his ears. He told me, moreover, that he could frequently see, rather than hear, the party-coloured wheels of a mazy sphere music deep, deep within the black dark of the cataract's roar. These impressions, which I protested must be merely antotic, had sometimes a pleasing effect upon him, and he would stand long to listen with a lifted hand to their seduction. Others again inflamed him to a mad anger. I guessed that they were the cause of those harks that, at intervals of an hour, did not fail to break from him. But in this I was wrong, and it was with a thrill of dismay that I soon came to know the truth. For as we were once passing by an iron door on the lower floor, he stopped, and for some minutes stood listening with a leer most keen and cunning. Presently the cry, "Hark!" escaped him, and he then turned to me and wrote on the tablet, "Did you not hear?" I had heard nothing but the roar, and he howled into my ear in sounds now audible to me as an echo caught far off in dreams. "You shall see!" He took up the candlestick, produced from the pocket of his robe a key, unlocked the iron door, and we passed into a room of very loftily domed in proportion to its area, and empty, save that a pair of steps lay against its wall, and that in the centre of its marble floor was a pool, like a Roman impluvium, only round like the room. A pool evidently profound in depth, full of a thick and inky fluid. I was very perturbed by its present aspect, for as the candle burned upon its surface, I observed that this had been quite recently disturbed, in a style for which the shivering of the house could not account, since ripples of slime were now rounding out from its middle to its brink. When I glanced at Harfager for explanation, he gave me a signal to wait, and now, for about an hour, with his hands behind his back, paced the chamber, but then paused, and we two stood together by the pool's margin, gazing into the water. Suddenly, his clutch tightened on my arm, and I saw with a touch of horror a tiny ball, probably of lead, bedaubed blood red by some chemical, fall from the roof and sink into the middle of the pool. It hissed on contact with the water, a whiff of mist. "The name of all that is sinister," I whispered. "What thing is this?" Again he made me a busy and confident signal to wait, moved the ladder steps towards the pool, handed me the taper. When I had mounted, holding high the light, I saw hanging out of the fogs in the dome a globe of old copper, lengthened into balloon shape by a neck, at the end of which I could spy a tiny hole. Painted over the globe was barely visible in red print letters, Harfager House, 1388 to 188. I was down quicker than I went up. "But the meaning," I panted. "Did you see the writing?" "Yes, the meaning." He wrote, "By comparing Gascoigne with Thrunster, I find that the house was built about 1389. But the last figures?" "After the last 8, he replied, "there is another figure, not quite obliterated by a tarnish spot." "What figure?" I asked. "Cannot be read, but may be surmised. As the year 1888 is now all but past, it can only be the figure 9. "Oh, you are depraved in mind," I cried, very irritated. "You assume, you state, in a manner which no mind trained to base its conclusions on facts can bear with patience." "And you're irrational," he wrote. "You know, I suppose, the formula of Archimedes, by which, the diameter of a globe being known, its volume also is known. Now, the diameter of that globe in the dome I know to be 4½ feet, and the diameter of the leaden balls about the third of an inch. Supposing, then, that 1389 was the year in which the globe was full of balls, you may readily calculate that not many fellows of the 4,000,000 and odd which have since dropped at the rate of 1 an hour are now left within. The fall of the balls cannot persist another year. Figure 9 is therefore forced upon us." "But you assume, Harfager," I cried. "Oh, believe me, my friend, this is the very wantonness of wickedness. By what algebra of despair do you know that each ball represents one of the scions of your house, or that the last date was intended to correspond with the stoppage of the horologe? And even if so, what is the significance of it? It can have no significance." "Do you want to madden me?" he shouted. Then furiously writing, "I swear that I know nothing of its significance. But it is not evident to you that the thing is a big hourglass, intended to count the hours, not of a day, but of a cycle, and of a cycle of 500 years?" "But the whole contrivance," I passionately cried, "is a baleful phantasm of our brains. How is the fall of the balls regulated? My friend, you wonder, your mind is debauched in this brawl of waters." "I have not ascertained," he replied, "by what internal works, or clammy medium, or spiral coil, dependent probably for its action upon the vibration of the mansion, the balls are retarded in their fall. That was a matter well within the skill of the medieval mechanic, the inventor of the clock. But this at least is clear, that one element of their retardation is the smallness of the aperture through which they have to pass. That this element, by known laws of statics, will cease to operate when no more than 3 balls remain, and that, consequently, the last 3 will fall at almost the same instant." "In heaven's name," I exclaimed, careless now what folly I poured out, "but your mother's dead, Harfager. Do you deny that there remain but you and the Lady Svertha? A glance of disdain was all the answer he then gave me as to this, but he confessed to me a day later that the leaden drops were a constant sorrow to his ears. From hour to hour his life was a keen waiting for their fall, that even from his brief sleeps he infallibly started awake at each descent, that in whatever region of the mansion he chanced to be, they found him out with a crashing loudness, and that each crash tweaked him with a twinge of anguish within the ear. I was therefore shocked at his declaration that these droppings had now become as the life of life to him, and he had acquired an entwining so close with the tone of his mind that their ceasing might even mean for him the reeling of reason, at which confession he sobbed with his face buried as he leant upon a column. When this paroxysm was past, I asked him if it was out of the question that he should once for all cast off the fascination of the horologe and escape with me from the place. He wrote in mysterious reply, "A threefold cord is not easily broken." I started, asking, "How threefold?" He wrote with a bitter smile, "To be in love with pain, to pine after aching, is not that a wicked madness?" I stood astonished that he had unconsciously quoted Gascoigne. A wicked madness, a lecherous anguish. "You have seen my aunt's face," he proceeded. "Your eyes were dim if you did not see in it an impious calm, the glee of a blasphemous patience, a grin behind her daring smile." He then spoke of a prospect at the terror of which his whole soul trembled, yet which sometimes laughed in his heart in the form of a hope. It was the prospect of any considerable increase in the volume of sound about his ears. At that, he said, the brain must totter. On the night of my arrival, the noise of my boots, and since then my voice occasionally raised, had produced acute pain in him. To such an ear, I understood him to say, the luxury of torture involved in a large sound increase around was an allurement from which no human virtue could turn. And when I said I could not even conceive such an increase, much less the means by which it could be effected, he brought out from the archives of the mansion some annals kept by the heads of the family. From these it appeared that the tempests that ever lacerated the latitude of Reba did not fail to give place, at intervals of some years, to one mammoth madness, one Samson among the merry men, and Sirius among the sons. At such periods the rains descended and the floods came, even as in the first world deluge. Those roasts or eddies which ever encircled Reba, spurning then the bands of lateral space, burst aloft into a whirl of waterspouts to dance about the little land, upon which, converging, some of them discharged their waters, and the locks which flowed to the cataract thus redoubled their volume, and crashed with redoubled roar. Harfager said it was miraculous that for 18 years no such grand event had transacted itself at Reba. And what, I asked, in addition to the dropping balls and the prospect of an increase of sound, is the third strand of that threefold cord of which you have spoken? For answer, he led me to a circular hall, which he said he had ascertained to be the centre of the circular mansion. It was a very large hall, so large as I think I never saw, so large that the amount of wall lighted at one time by the candle seemed nearly flat, and nearly the whole of its area, from floor to roof, was occupied by a column of brass, the space between the wall and column being only such as to admit of a stretched-out arm. "This column," Harfager wrote, "goes up to the dome and passes beyond it. It goes down to the lower floor and passes through that. It goes down thence to the brazen flooring of the vaults and passes through that into the bedrock. Under each floor it spreads out, helping to support the floor. What is the precise quality of the impression which I have made upon your mind by this description?" I do not know," I answered, turning from him. "Ask me none of your enigmas, Harfager. I feel a giddiness." "But answer me," he said. "Consider the strangeness of that brazen lowest floor, which I have discovered to be some 6 feet thick, and whose under surface I have reason to think is somewhat above the bedrock. Remember that the fabric is at no point fastened to the column. Think of the chains which ray out from the outer wall, apparently anchoring the house to the ground. Tell me, what impression have I now made?" "And it is for this you wait?" I cried. "Yet there may been no malevolent intention. You jump at conclusions. Any fixed building in such a land and spot as this would at any time be liable to be broken up by some sovereign tempest. What if it was the intention of the builder that in such a case the chains should break and the building, by yielding, be saved? You have no lack of charity, at least, he replied, and then we went back to the book we were reading together. He had not wholly lost the old habit of study, although he could no longer get himself to sit to read. So with a volume, often tossed down, he would stamp about within region of the lamplight, or I, unconscious of my voice, might read to him. By a whim of his mood, the few books which now lay within the limits of his patience had all for their motive something of the picaresque or the foppishly speculative. Gravado's Tacano, or the System of Tycho Brahe. Above all, George Hakewill's Power and Providence of God. One day, however, as I read, he interrupted me with the sentence, apropos of nothing, "What I cannot understand is that you, a scientist, should believe that life ceases with a ceasing of breathing." And from that moment the tone of our reading changed, for he led me to the crypts of the library in the lowest part of the building, and hour after hour, with a furor of triumph, overwhelmed me with books proving the length of life after death. What, he asked, was my opinion of Baron Verulam's account of the dead man who was heard to utter words of prayer, or of the bounding bowels of the dead convict. On my expressing unbelief, he seemed surprised, and reminded me of the writhings of dead cobras, of the long beating of a frog's heart after death. "She is not dead," he quoted, "but sleepeth." The idea of Bacon and Paracelsus, that the principle of life resides in a spirit or fluid, was proof to him that such fluid could not, from its very nature, undergo any sudden annihilation, while the organs which it pervades remain. When I asked what limit he then set to the persistence of life in the dead, he answered that when decay had so far advanced that the nerves could no longer be called nerves, or when the brain had been disconnected at the neck from the body, or as by rats gnawing, then the king of terrors was king verily. With an indiscretion strange to me before my residence at Reba, I now blurted out the question whether in all this he could be referring to his mother. For a while he stood thoughtful, then wrote, "Even if I had not reason to believe that my own and Svertha's life in some way hung upon the final cessation of hers, I should still have taken precautions to ascertain the march of the destroyer on her frame. As it is, I shall not lack even the exactest information." He then explained that the rats which ran riot in the place of death would in time do their full work upon her, but would be unable to reach to the region of the throat without first gnawing their way through the 3 strings stretched across the holes of the bridges within the coffin, and thus, one by one, liberating the 3 Morisco bells to tinklings. The winter solstice had gone, another year began. I was sleeping a deep sleep by night when Harfager came into my chamber and shook me. His face was ghastly in the taper's glare. A change within a short time had taken place upon him. He was hardly the same. He was like some poor wight into whose surprised eyes in the night have pried the eyes of a fright. He said that he was aware of strainings and creakings, which gave him the feeling of being suspended in airy space by a thread which must break to his weight, and he begged me, for God's sake, to accompany him to the coffins. We passed together through the house, he craven, haggard, his gait now laggard, into the chamber of the dead, where he stole to and fro, examining the shelves. Out of the footless coffin of the dowager, trembling on its bench, I saw a water-rat crawl, and as Harfager passed beneath one of the shortest of the shelves which bore one coffin, it suddenly dropped from a height to dust at his feet. He screamed the cry of a frightened creature, tottered to my support, and I bore him back to the upper parts of the palace. He sat with his face buried in a corner of a small chamber, doddering, overtaken as it were by the extremity of age, no longer marking with his hark the fall of the leaden drops. To my remonstrances he responded only with the moan, "So soon!" Whenever I looked for him, I found him there, his manhood now collapsed in an ague. I do not think that during this time he slept. On the second night, as I was approaching him, he sprang suddenly upright with the cry, "The first bell is tinkling!" And he had scarcely screamed it when, from some long way off, a faint wail, which at its origin must have been a fierce shriek, reached my now feverish ears. Harfaker, for his part, clapped his palms to his ears and dashed from his place, I following a hot chase through the black breadth of the mansion, till we came to a chamber containing a candelabrum, and arrayed in faded red. On the floor in swoon lay the Lady Svertha, her dark grey hair in disarray, wrapping her like an angry sea, tufts of it scattered, torn from the roots, and on her throat prints of strangling fingers. We bore her to her bed in an alcove, and having discovered some tincture in a chamber, I administered it between her fixed teeth. In her rapid countenance I saw that death was not, and as I found something appalling in her aspect, shortly afterwards left her to Harfager. When I next saw him, his manner had undergone a kind of change which I can only describe as gruesome. It resembled the officious self-importance seen in a person of weak intellect who spurs himself with the thought, "To business, the time is short," while his walk sickened me with a hint of ataxia locomotrice. When I asked him as to his aunt and the meaning of the marks of violence on her body, bending ear to his deep and unctuous tones, I could hear, "An attempt has been made upon her life by the skeleton eighth." He seemed not to share my astonishment at this thing, nor could give me any clear answer as to his reason for retaining such a servant, or as to the origin of Eighth's service. Eighth, he told me, had been admitted into the palace during the period of his own absence in youth, and he knew little of him, beyond the fact that he was extraordinarily strong. Whence he had come, or how, no person except the Lady Svertha was aware, and she, it seems, feared, or at least persistently flinched from admitting him into the mystery. He added that, as a matter of fact, the lady, from the day of his coming back to Reba, had with some object imposed upon herself a dumbness on all subjects, which he had never once known her to break through, except by an occasional note. With an ataxic strenuousness, with the airs of a drunken man constraining himself to ordered action, Harfager now set himself to the doing of a host of trivial things. He collected chronicles and arranged them in order of date. He docketed or ticketed packets of documents. He insisted upon my assistance in turning the faces of paintings to the wall. He was, however, now constantly stopped by bursts of vertigo, 6 times in 1 hour being hurled to the ground, while blood frequently guttered from his ears. He complained to me in a tone of piteous wail of the wooing of a silver piccolo that continually seduced him. As he bent sweating over his momentous nothings, his hands fluttered like aspen. I noted the movement of his whimpering lips, the rheum of his sunken eyes. Sudden doting had come upon his youth. On a day he threw it utterly off and was young and new. He entered my room, roused me from dreams. I observed the lunacy of bliss in his eyes, heard his hiss in my ear, "Up! The storm!" Ah, I had known it. In the nightmare of the night, I felt it in the air of the room. It had come. I saw it lurid by the lamplight on the hell of Harfager's face. A glee burst at once into birth within me as I sprang from my couch, glancing at the clock. It was 8 in the morning. Harfager, with the naked stalk of some maniac prophet, had already taken himself away, and I started out after him. A deepening was clearly felt in the quivering of the edifice. Anon for a second it stopped still, as if breathlessly to listen. Its air was troubled with a vague gustiness. Occasionally there came to me, as it were, the noisings of some far-off lamentation and voice in Ramah, but whether this was in my ear or the screaming of the gale I could not tell. Or again I could hear one clear chord of an organ's vaunt. About noon I spied Harfager, lamp in hand, running along a corridor with naked souls. As we met he looked at me, but hardly with recognition, and passed by. Stopped, however, and ran back to howl into my ear the question, "Would you see?" He then beckoned before me, and I followed to a very small opening in the outer wall, closed with a slab of brass. As he lifted the latch, the slab dashed inward with instant impetuosity and tossed him a long way, while the breath of the tempest, braying through the brazen tube with a brutal bravura, caught and pinned me in a corner of the wall. and all down the corridor a long crashing racket of crowds of pictures and couches followed. I nevertheless managed to push my way on the belly to the opening. Hence the sea should have been visible, but my senses were met by nothing but a vision of tumbled tenebrousness and a general impression of the letter O. The sun of Reba had gone out. In a moment of opportunity, our two forces got the shutter shut again. Come. He had obtained a fresh glimmer and beckoned before me. Let's see how the dead fare in the great desolation. And we ran, but had hardly got to the middle of the stairway when I was thrilled by the consciousness of some great shock, the bass of a dull thud, which nothing save the thumping to the floor of the whole lump of the coffins could have caused. I looked for Harfager, and for a moment only saw his heels skedaddling, panic-hounded, his ears stopped, his mouth round. Then, indeed, fear reached me, a tremor in the audacity of my heart, a thought that now, at any rate, I must desert him in his extremity and work out my own salvation. Yet it was with hesitancy that I turned to search for him, for the last farewell, a hesitancy which I felt to be not unselfish, but selfish and unhealthy. I rambled through the night, seeking light, and having happened upon a lamp, proceeded to seek for Harfager. Several hours went by in this way, during which I could not doubt from the state of the air in the house that the violence about me was being wildly heightened. Sounds as of screams, unreal like the shriekings of demons, now reached my ears. As the time of night came on, I began to detect in the greatly augmented baritone of the cataract a fresh character, a shrillness, the whistle of rapture, of malice, the menace of a rabies blind and deaf. It must have been at about the hour of 6 that I found Harfager. He sat in an obscure room with his brow bowed down, his hands on his knees, his face covered with hair and with blood from the ears. The right sleeve of his robe had been rent away in some renewed attempt, I imagine, to manage a window, and the rather crushed arm hung lank from the shoulder. For some time I stood and eyed him, mouthing his mumblings, but now that I had found him, uttered nothing as to my departure. Presently he looked sharply up with the call, "Hark!" Then with impatience, "Hark! Hark!" Then with a shout, "The second bell!" And again, in immediate sequence upon his shout, there sounded a wail, vague yet real, through the house. Harfager at the instant dropped reeling with giddiness, but I snatched up a lamp, dashed out, shivering but eager. For some while the wild wailing went on, either actually or by reflex action of my ear. And as I ran for the lady's apartment, I saw opposite to it the open door of an armory, into which I passed, caught up a battle-axe, and was now about to dart in to her aid, when Aeth, the blazing eye, shied out of her chamber. I cast up my axe, and shouting, dashed forward to down him. But by some chance the lamp fell from me, and before I knew anything more, the axe sprang from my grasp, and I was cast far backward by some most grim vigour. There was, however, enough light shining out of the chamber to show that the skeleton had darted into the door of the armory, so I instantly slammed and locked the door near me by which I had procured the axe, and hurrying to the other, secured it too. Aeth was thus a prisoner. I then entered the lady's chamber. She lay over the bed in the alcove, and to my bent ear grossly croaked the ruckle of death. A glance at her mangled throat convinced me that her last moments were come. I settled her on the bed, curtained her with the loosened festoons of the hangings of black, and turned from the cursedness of her aspect. On an escritoire near, I noticed a note, intended apparently for Harfager. "I mean to defy and fly, not from fear, but from the delight of the defiance itself. Can you come?" Taking a flame from the candelabrum, I left her to her loneliness and throes of her death. I had passed some way backward when I was startled by a queer sound, a crash, resembling the crash of a tambourine, and as I could hear it pretty clearly, and from a distance, this meant some prodigious energy. In 2 minutes it again broke out, and thenceforth at regular intervals, with an effect of pain upon me, and the conviction grew gradually within me that Aeth had unhung 2 of the old brass shields from their pegs, and holding them by their handles, and dashing them viciously together, thus expressed the frenzy that had now overtaken him. When I found my way back to Harfager, very anguish was now stamping in him about the chamber. He shook his head like a tormented horse, brushing and barring from his hearing each crash of the brass shields. "Ah, when? He hoarsely groaned into my ear. Will that ruckle cease in our throat? I will myself, I tell you, with my own hand. Oh, God! Since the morning, his auditory fever, as indeed my own also, appeared to have increased in steady proportion with the roaring and screeching chaos round, and the death struggle in the lady's throat bitterly filled for him the intervals of the grisly cymbaling of eighth. He presently sent twinkling fingers into the air, and with his arms cast out, darted into the darkness. And again I sought him, and long again in vain. As the hours passed and the day deepened toward its baleful midnight, the cry of the now redoubled cataract, mixed with the mass and majesty of the now climatic tempest, took on too intentional a shriek to be longer tolerable for any reason. My own mind escaped my sway and went its way, for here in the hotbed of fever I was fevered. I wandered from chamber to chamber, precipitate, dizzy to the upbuoyance of a joy. As a man upon whom sleep seizes, so I had fallen. Even yet, as I passed near the region of the armory, the rapturous shields of eighth did not fail to smash faintly upon my ear. Harfager I did not see, for he too was doubtless roaming a hurtling Algeciras round the world of the house. However, at about midnight, observing light shining from a door on the lower stage, I entered and saw him there, the chamber of the dropping horologe. He sat hugging himself on the ladder steps, gazing at the gloomy pool. The final lights of the riot of the day seemed dying in his eyes, and he gave me no glance as I ran in. His hands, his bare arm, were all washed with new-shed blood, but of this, too, he looked unconscious. His mouth was hanging open to his pantings. As I eyed him, he suddenly leapt high, smiting his hands with the yell, "The last bell tinkling!" and ran out raving. He therefore did not see, though he may have understood by hearing, the thing which, with cowering awe, I now saw, for a ball slipped from the horologe with a hiss and mist of smoke into the pool, and while the clock once ticked another, and while the clock yet ticked another, and the smoke of the first had not perfectly thinned when the smoke of the third, mixing with it, floated toward the dome. Understanding that the sands of the mansion were run, I too, throwing up my arm, rushed from the spot, but was suddenly stopped in my flight by the sense of some stupendous destiny emptying its vials upon the edifice, and was made aware by a crackling racket like musketry above and the downpour of a world of waters that some waterspout in the waltz and whirl had hurled its broken summit upon us and burst through the dome. At that moment I beheld Harfager running towards me, his hands buried in his hair, and as he raced past I caught him, crying, "Harfager, save yourself! The very fountains, Harfager! By the grand God, man!" I hissed it in his inmost ear. "The very fountains of the great deep!" He glared at me and went on his way, while I, whisking myself into a room, closed the door. Here for some time with weak knees I waited, but the eagerness of my frenzy pressed me, and I again stepped out to find the corridors everywhere thigh-deep with water, while rags of the storm, bragging through the hole in the dome, were now blustering about the house. My light was at once puffed out, but I was surprised by the presence of another light, more ghostly, gloomy, bluish, mild yet wild, which now gloated everywhere through the house. I was standing in wonder at this when a gust of auguster passion galloped up the mansion, and with it I was made aware of the snap of something somewhere. There was a minute's infinite waiting, and then, quick, ever quicker, came the throb, snap, pop, in spacious succession of the anchoring chains of the mansion before the hurried shoulder of the hurricane. And again, a second of breathless stillness, and then, deliberately, its hour came. The house moved. My flesh worked like the flesh of worms which squirm, slowly moved and stopped. Then there was a sweep and a swirl and a pause, then a swirl and a sweep and a pause, then steady labor on the brazen axis as the laborer tramps by the harrow, then a heightening of zest, then intensity, then the final light liveliness of flight. And now, once again, as staggering and plunging I spun, the notion of escape for a moment came to me, but this time I shook an impious fist. "No, but God, no, no!" I gasped. "I will no more go from here. There let me waltzing pass in this carnival of the vortices, anarchy of the thunders. And I ran, staggering, but memory gropes in a grayer gloaming as to all that followed. I struggled up the stairway, now flowing like a river, and for a good while ran staggering and plunging, full of wild rantings about amid the downfall of roofs and the ruins of walls. The air was thick with splashes, the whole roof now, save 3 rafters, having been snatched by the wind away, and in the blush of that bluish moonshine the tapestries were flapping and trailing wildly out after the flying place, like the streaming hair of some ranting fakir stung reeling by the tarantulas of distraction. At one point where the largest of the porticos protruded, the mansion began at every revolution to bump with grum shudderings against some obstruction. It bumped, and while the lips said 1, 2, 3, it 3 times bumped again. It was the maenadsm of mass, swift, still swifter, and an ague of flurry it raced, every portico a sail to the gale, racking its great frame to fragments. I, running by the door of a room littered with the ruins of a wall, saw through that livid moonlight Harfager sitting on a tomb, a drum by him, upon which with a club in his bloody fist he feebly but persistingly beat. The speed of the leaning house had now attained the sleeping stage, that last pitch of the spinning top, and now, all at once, Harfager dashed away the mat of hair which wrapped his face, sprang, stretched his arms, and began to spin giddily in the same direction as the mansion, nor less sleep-embathed, with lifted hair, with quivering cheeks. From such a sight I shied with retching, and staggering, plunging, presently found myself on the lower floor opposite a porch, where an outer door, chancing to crash before me, the breath of the tempest smote freshly upon me. On this an impulse, partly of madness, more of sanity, spurred in my soul, and I spurted out of the doorway, to be whirled far out into the limbo without. The river at once rushed me deep drenched toward the sea, though even there, in the depth of whirlpool, a shrill din like the splitting of a world reached my ears. It had hardly passed when my body butted in its course upon one of the arches, cushioned with seaweed, of the not all demolished causeway. Nor had I utterly lost consciousness. A clutch freed my head from the drench, and in the end I heaved myself to the level of the summit, hence to the ledge of rock by which I had come, the bridge being intact. I rode myself on my face under the thumps of the wind, and under the rushing of rain, like a shimmering of silk through the air. Noticing the same wild shining about me which had blushed through the broken dome into the mansion, I glanced backward and saw that the dwelling of the Harfagers was a memory of the past. Then upward in the whole north heaven to the zenith shone one ocean of variegated glories, the aurora borealis, which was being fairly brushed and flustered by the gale. At the augustness of which sight I was touched to a gush of tears. And with them the dream broke, the infatuation passed. A palm seemed to skin back from my brain the films and media of delusion. On my knees I threw my hands to heaven in thankfulness for the marvel of my rescue from all the temptation, the tribulation, and the breakage of Reba.